Picture this. You are a French missionary in Madagascar, 1835. You've been teaching the gospel for 7 years. This morning, Queen Ranavalona's soldiers arrived at your church. They're not here to pray. They hand you a wooden cup filled with murky brown liquid, 3 crushed Tangina nuts mixed with chicken blood and river water. The mixture smells like rotting almonds and iron. The Queen has decided you're a threat to Madagascar's traditions. This poison will determine your guilt. If you vomit it up and survive, you're innocent. If you die, which 90% of people do, you were guilty all along. God's will, the Queen says, works through poison. You watch your congregation, 300 Malagasy Christians you personally converted, being forced to drink first. A mother of 4 collapses after 2 minutes, blood frothing from her mouth, her children screaming as soldiers hold them back. A teenage boy who was baptized last Easter convulses on the ground, his internal organs liquefying from the poison, visible through the blood he's vomiting. Your translator, who helped you create the first Malagasy Bible, is already dead, his face frozen in an expression of agony that will haunt the witnesses forever. The cup is now in your hands. It's warm from the blood. Chunks of nut float on the surface. You have 10 seconds to drink, or they'll force it down your throat while your congregation watches. Tomorrow, if you somehow survive, you'll be thrown off Ambohipitsi Cliff with the other foreign influences. If you die today from the poison, your body will be fed to dogs because Christians don't deserve burial. The Queen has a special pen of dogs fed exclusively on executed criminals. They've developed a taste for human flesh. Either way, your 7 years of work ends here. The 300 souls you saved will die or renounce their salvation. The school you built will be torn down brick by brick. The books you printed will fuel tonight's bonfire. The Queen has decided that Madagascar will be purified of foreign influence, even if she has to poison half her population to achieve it. This is Queen Ranavalona I, who ruled Madagascar from 1828 to 1861. During her 33-year reign, she may have killed over half her country's population. We're talking about 2.5 million people out of 5 million total, not through war or famine, but through systematic execution, forced labor, and her favorite method, making people drink poison to prove their innocence. European colonizers who had conquered most of Africa called her the Mad Queen of Madagascar. Her own people called her Ranavalona, the Cruel. History calls her the blood-drinking queen, though she probably never literally drank blood. What she actually did was worse. She turned an entire island the size of France into a laboratory for human suffering, using ancient traditions as weapons against anyone who threatened her absolute power. You're about to discover how a common-born woman became Madagascar's most terrifying ruler, how she kept European colonizers out when the rest of Africa was being carved up like a birthday cake at the Berlin Conference, and how she managed to kill millions of her own people while dying peacefully in her silk-sheeted bed at age 83, never facing a single consequence for 3 decades of systematic terror. The future Blood Queen wasn't born royal. She was born Ramavo around 1778 in a mud brick house where rain came through the roof. Her father herded zebu cattle for nobles who wouldn't speak to him directly. Her mother wove baskets that sold for less than the materials cost to make them. Nobody expected this girl to one day control the life and death of every person on an island larger than California. Everything changed on a humid night when Ramavo was 16. She was collecting water from the communal well when she overheard palace servants discussing plans to assassinate Prince Radama, heir to the throne. The conspirators were planning to poison his evening meal with ground glass mixed into his rice. Instead of staying silent like a commoner should, she ran 2 miles barefoot to the palace and warned him. The assassination failed. The grateful king, Andrea Nampoini Marina, Radama's father, rewarded Ramavo with something unprecedented, marriage to the prince she had saved. A cattle herder's daughter would become royalty, but This wasn't a fairy tale. Prince Radama had his own ideas about marriage. He took 11 more wives, all from noble families, and treated Ramavo as the least important, the charity case, the commoner who didn't belong. For 12 years, she watched from the edges of power, while Radama transformed Madagascar through partnerships with British missionaries and military advisors. He modernized the army using British tactics, introduced European education that created Madagascar's first literate generation, and allowed Christianity to spread like wildfire through traditional communities. Ramavo watched, learned, and waited. When King Radama died in 1828 at age 35, officially from alcohol poisoning but more likely from actual poison that turned his lips blue and his fingernails black, he left no designated heir. The death was suspicious. Radama had been healthy 3 days earlier. The symptoms matched arsenic poisoning, not alcohol. The person who served his final meal was never questioned. That person had been appointed by Ramavo. Malagasy tradition dictated that the highest-ranking wife should rule. That wasn't Ramavo. She was 12th of 12 wives. But traditions, she had learned during her years of watching, were only as strong as the soldiers enforcing them. Within 72 hours of Radama's death, she had orchestrated the most efficient coup in Madagascar's history. She secured the loyalty of key military officers by promising them control over entire provinces. She convinced the priests that the ancestors had chosen her through dreams and omens she fabricated with the help of palace servants she'd been cultivating for years. Most importantly, she eliminated every rival with surgical precision that would make Machiavelli proud. Radama's nephew, the most legitimate heir, was found dead in his bed, supposedly from sudden illness that turned his skin purple. His mother died the same night from the same mysterious ailment. Their food taster, who should have died first if it was poison, was mysteriously absent and never found. Radama's highest-ranking wife attempted to flee the capital, but was caught at the river. Ramavo had her strangled with silk scarves, an honorable death for royalty that left no marks and required no confession. The remaining family members, 43 people ranging from aged uncles to infant cousins, were gathered in the palace courtyard at Spear Point. Ramavo, now calling herself Ranavalona, gave them a choice announced by the royal herald: acknowledge her as queen immediately and live in comfortable exile, or contest her claim and die before sunset. 11 chose exile. 4 chose death, believing other nobles would rally to avenge them. She had their heads removed with ceremonial swords, displayed on the palace walls for exactly 3 days, then fed to crocodiles in the royal pond. No nobles rallied. Her coronation on June 12, 1828, was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that combined fear with tradition. She appeared wearing King Radama's military uniform, modified to fit her but maintaining its masculine authority, sending the message that she was both woman and warrior. She carried his sword, his scepter, and most importantly, she brought out the ancient Sampi, 12 sacred idols that hadn't been seen in decades, claiming they had called her to power through visions. During the coronation speech, delivered from a platform built over the execution ground, still stained with rivals' blood, she announced her governing philosophy in words that would prove prophetic. "I will not change the laws of our 12 ancestors. Those who dare to disobey will be punished with death. The ocean shall be the boundary of my rice field, and I will not surrender 1 grain of sand to foreign powers. Any who challenge this will learn that the ancestors' justice is swift and final." Within the first month, she reversed Radama's modernizations with brutal efficiency. The British military advisors were given 24 hours to leave or face trial by Tangina. The missionaries were restricted to a compound in the capital where guards recorded every conversation. The schools teaching European knowledge were not just closed but demolished. Their bricks used to build execution platforms. Madagascar would return to its roots, she declared, even if she had to water those roots with enough blood to turn the rivers red. But Ranavalona understood power in ways her predecessors hadn't. She created a new noble class entirely dependent on her favor, promoting commoners who had no traditional power base and whose survival depended on absolute loyalty. She established a network of informants in every village, offering rewards for reporting suspicious behavior. 5 silver coins for reporting a Christian, 10 for reporting a conspiracy, 20 for reporting hidden foreigners. She turned the traditional council of nobles into a theatrical performance where disagreeing with the queen meant failing the next Tangina ordeal. The Tangina ordeal became her signature tool of control. This ancient practice of trial by poison had existed for centuries, but previous rulers used it perhaps a dozen times per year. Ranavalona industrialized it. She established Tangina administrators in every district, created standardized poison preparations with instruction manuals, and most brilliantly, made the ordeal retroactively applicable. You could be forced to drink poison for crimes you allegedly committed years before she was even queen. One noble was tried for a conversation he'd had in 1828 years before her reign began. You could be accused on a Monday morning, tried on Tuesday at noon, and dead by Wednesday sunset. That was justice under Ranavalona's Tangina system. The accusation could be anything. Practicing Christianity, speaking to foreigners, owning property your neighbor wanted, appearing in someone's dream, committing a crime, or simply looking at the queen's shadow, which was considered sacred and untouchable. Dreams, the queen declared, were messages from the ancestors, and therefore more reliable than eyewitness testimony. The Tangina nut came from a tree that grew wild in Madagascar's eastern rainforests. When crushed and mixed with liquid, it created a poison that attacked the nervous system, causing violent vomiting, internal bleeding, paralysis, and usually death within hours. The active toxin was similar to strychnine, but worse, causing muscles to contract so violently that people broke their own bones from convulsions. But Ranavalona didn't just use it as poison. She transformed it into a theological weapon. God, or the ancestors, would protect the innocent by making them vomit the poison. The guilty would die. Divine justice through botanical toxin. The process was ritualized to maximize terror and community participation. When accused, you had 3 days to prepare, though preparation was largely futile. You could gather character witnesses, though their testimony meant nothing if they wouldn't risk drinking Tangina themselves to prove your innocence. You could pray to your ancestors, though they seemed remarkably unhelpful when faced with alkaloid poisoning. Most people spent those 3 days distributing their possessions to prevent confiscation, saying goodbye to children they'd never see grow up, and desperately trying to eat foods that might help them vomit. Raw eggs mixed with palm oil was popular. It rarely worked. On trial day, the entire village was required to attend. Absence was considered sympathy with the accused and grounds for your own trial. The Tangina administrator, always a woman trained personally in the capital and paid directly by the crown, would arrive with her ceremonial tools in a basket made from human hair, a wooden cup carved from the tree that grew over a mass grave, a knife for crushing the nuts that had been used in at least 100 previous executions, a cloth for straining the mixture that was dyed with the blood of those who had failed the ordeal. Everything had symbolic meaning that reinforced the queen's power over life and death. The accused would be presented with 3 Tangina nuts, Ranavalona's innovation from the traditional single nut. 3 ensured that survival was nearly impossible while maintaining the fiction that innocence was protection. The nuts would be crushed in front of everyone, mixed with chicken blood for added potency, and stirred with a bone from a previous victim, usually a finger bone worn smooth from repeated use. You were literally drinking death mixed with death, served by death. Before drinking, you made a public declaration that revealed the perverse theology of the system. If guilty, may the Tangina kill you slowly and painfully. If innocent, may you vomit and live to serve the queen another day. Then you drank. The crowd watched. The administrator counted slowly to 3,600, one number for each ancestor watching from the spirit world. If you vomited within 1 hour and survived, you were innocent, but usually damaged for life. If you died, your guilt was confirmed, and your family inherited your shame. If you survived but didn't vomit, you drank again. Some people endured 5 rounds before dying, their stomachs containing enough poison to kill 20 men. The statistics were genocidal by any definition. Contemporary missionary records, hidden in hollow trees and buried jars to avoid confiscation, estimate that between 1828 and 1861, approximately 200,000 people underwent the Tangina ordeal. 20,000 survived. The other 180,000 died, proving their guilt for crimes that often existed only in accusers' imaginations or the Queen's paranoia. A nobleman named Ranavalona was accused of plotting against the Queen by a rival who wanted his lands. His evidence of innocence was that he had personally executed 12 of the Queen's enemies and had their heads delivered to the palace in silk bags. "Irrelevant," said the administrator. "Past loyalty doesn't prevent future betrayal." He drank the Tangina in front of his 5 children and died in 40 minutes, blood pouring from his nose, ears, and eyes while his family watched. His estates were confiscated that afternoon. His children were enslaved that evening. His name was banned from being spoken by the next morning. The rival who accused him moved into his house before the bloodstains dried. A pregnant woman named Ranavalona was accused of witchcraft by her mother-in-law, who wanted her gone to make room for a new wife for her son. The Tangina administrator declared that the unborn child would also be tested through the mother's ordeal, 2 souls judged with 1 cup. Ranavalona drank the poison while 7 months pregnant. She survived 90 minutes, longer than most, before dying in convulsions so violent they induced premature labor. The administrator declared both mother and unborn child guilty of witchcraft. Their bodies were dragged outside the village and left for wild dogs, which had learned to gather whenever they heard the drums announcing a Tangina trial. Children weren't exempt from divine justice through poison. A 10-year-old boy named Andrew was accused of stealing rice from the royal granary. Witnesses swore he was 20 miles away when the theft occurred, working in his family's fields. The Queen's response, delivered through her administrator: "The ancestors see beyond distance and time. Guilt can travel through dreams." The boy was given a child's dose, half the adult amount, which paradoxically made death slower. He lasted 3 hours, vomiting blood continuously, but never the poison itself. The administrator declared it a sign of exceptional guilt, requiring exceptional punishment. He was forced to drink again and died instantly, his small body unable to process double poison. The economic impact was catastrophic beyond simple death tolls. Successful merchants would be accused by competitors and eliminated through Tangina, taking their trade secrets to the grave. Skilled craftsmen would die, taking their knowledge with them, entire industries disappearing one accusation at a time. Families would be destroyed when one member was accused and their relatives were tested as potential accomplices. Madagascar's population, estimated at 5 million when Ranavalona took power, fell below 2.5 million by her death, with Tangina being the single largest cause. Some villages developed desperate survival strategies. They would bribe the administrator to use older, less potent nuts that had lost some toxicity. They would secretly induce vomiting before the ceremony, hoping residual effects would help during the actual ordeal. They created underground networks to help accused people flee to the forests before trial, living as outlaws rather than face the cup. The Queen responded by making fleeing from Tangina punishable by immediate execution of your entire family, including infants, without trial. The missionaries thought they were saving souls from damnation. Ranavalona thought they were stealing souls from Madagascar. When she discovered that 200,000 Malagasy had converted to Christianity under her nose, her response was biblical in its fury, though decidedly Old Testament in its mercy. The purge that followed would make Nero look tolerant. February 26th, 1835. Ranavalona summoned every known Christian to the palace grounds, spreading word that she wanted to understand their faith. They came hopefully, thinking dialogue was possible. Some brought their hand-copied Bibles, painstakingly transcribed in secret since printing was forbidden. Parents brought children they had baptized in forest streams. Congregations arrived singing hymns. What they found was 15,000 soldiers surrounding the square and the Queen, standing on a platform built from the destroyed pulpits of burned churches. "The ancestors have spoken to me in dreams of fire," she declared, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "These foreign gods are parasites eating our traditions from within. From this moment, practicing Christianity is treason against Madagascar, against your ancestors, and against me. You have 7 days to renounce your foreign god and return to the ancestors. After that, you face judgment. Not the judgment of your false heaven, but the judgment of Tangina, of cliffs, of fire." The 7 days that followed saw Madagascar split into 2 psychological nations. Christians gathered in homes, praying for strength, debating whether martyrdom or survival better served God. Some chose to flee to the forests, becoming outlaws for Christ. Others decided to stand firm, believing their deaths would plant seeds of faith. Traditional Malagasy, who had tolerated or ignored the converts, suddenly became informants, seeing opportunity in the Queen's fury. Neighbor reported on neighbor for silver coins. Children were interrogated about their parents' prayers, rewarded with sweets for revealing prayer meetings. On day 8, the executions began with theatrical precision. But Ranavalona didn't simply kill Christians. She choreographed their deaths as theological mockery. Each execution method was chosen to ridicule Christian beliefs. Those who spoke of resurrection were buried alive to see if they could rise on the 3rd day. Those who preached about walking on water were tied to stones and thrown into rivers to test their faith. Those who talked about ascending to heaven were thrown from cliffs to see if angels would catch them. The executions were public lessons that Christianity was powerless against Malagasy tradition. Ambohipotsi Cliff became the primary execution site, a 150-foot vertical drop onto jagged rocks that had been sharpened by prisoners specifically to ensure no one survived the fall. The condemned were brought in groups, tied together with ropes made from church altar cloths. So when one was pushed, all fell together. Parents and children were often bound together, the Queen's way of ensuring Christian families stayed together in death, as they had prayed to be in life. The impact was so violent that bodies often broke apart, creating a rain of flesh that traumatized even hardened soldiers. A young woman named Rasalama became the first official Malagasy Christian martyr, though many had already died. A nobleman's daughter who had learned to read specifically to study the Bible, she refused to renounce her faith despite her family's begging. The Queen ordered her speared to death publicly, but slowly, with small wounds that would take hours to kill. 14 spears, 1 for each year of Christ's hidden childhood. As Rasalama bled in the market square, she sang hymns she had memorized. The executioners were ordered to cut out her tongue. She hummed until she died 6 hours later. Her body was left on display for a week, guards preventing her family from retrieving it, as a warning that became a shrine when Christians secretly came at night to pray. The missionaries themselves faced special persecution, designed to break their faith publicly. Reverend David Johns had spent 15 years translating the entire Bible into Malagasy, creating the first written form of many words. Ranavalona had him watch, as every copy was burned in front of his congregation, the smoke black with ink. Then she offered him a choice, written in perfect theological cruelty. Drink Tangina, or watch his converts. Drink it one by one until he renounced his God. Johns chose to watch. After seeing 12 people die, including a boy he had baptized the previous Easter, he broke, renounced Christianity, and was expelled from Madagascar. He spent his final years in a London asylum, speaking only to invisible Malagasy Christians. But the Christians adapted with the ingenuity of the persecuted. They developed an underground church that operated through coded language and secret symbols. A specific pattern of weaving in baskets meant a prayer meeting that night. Certain songs about harvests were actually hymns with changed words. Bibles were hidden in rice storage jars, buried in false graves, sewn into the linings of children's clothes. Baptisms happened at night in forest streams, with lookouts posted for miles. Communion used honey and water instead of wine and bread, elements that wouldn't arouse suspicion if discovered. The Queen's informants responded, with increased scrutiny that made the Spanish Inquisition look casual. They looked for people who closed their eyes before meals, potentially praying. They watched for those who wouldn't participate fully in ancestor worship, noting anyone whose offerings seemed half-hearted. They monitored anyone who could read, since literacy had become associated with Christianity through the missionaries' schools. Simply owning paper could trigger accusation. One woman was executed for possessing a French shopping list from 10 years earlier, deemed evidence of Christian sympathies. Mary Raffaravavi, a noble's daughter who had converted, became a symbol of supernatural resistance. She survived the Tangina ordeal 3 times, vomiting the poison each time within minutes, something that shouldn't have been physiologically possible. The Queen, frustrated and perhaps frightened, ordered her executed by burning. The pyre was lit 3 times and extinguished by sudden rainstorms each time, though the sky had been clear moments before. Finally, Ranavalona had her thrown from Ambohipatsi. Mary's survival of Tangina became legend among hidden Christians, proof that God could overcome even the Queen's poison. By 1840, an estimated 20,000 Christians had been executed through various methods. 50,000 had fled to the forests where they lived like animals, and perhaps 100,000 had publicly renounced their faith while practicing in secret, creating a shadow church that existed in whispers and hidden rooms. Christianity in Madagascar became something unique, a faith defined entirely by persecution, practiced by people who expected to die for beliefs they couldn't abandon. Every Monday morning in Antananarivo, the capital, a drum would sound at dawn. Not the gentle wake-up call of roosters, but the bone-deep thunder of the labor drum. Every male between 16 and 60 had exactly 1 minute to drop whatever they were doing and report to their assigned gathering point. A man could be making love to his wife, eating his only meal, or dying from fever. It didn't matter. Failure to appear meant your family would undergo the Tangina ordeal. This was Fanampoana, forced labor, and under Ranavalona, it became a machine that consumed human beings as fuel for her building projects. The Queen wanted palaces that would make European monarchs weep with envy, not just residences, but monuments to her power that would dwarf anything previous rulers had built and outlast anything Europeans could bomb. The Rova Palace complex needed to be expanded from 12 buildings to 40. New fortifications were required around the capital, walls so thick that cannon fire would bounce off. Roads must connect every major town to demonstrate royal control, carved through mountains and spanning ravines. All of this would be built by unpaid laborers who were expected to feed themselves, house themselves, and consider it an honor to die for the Queen's architecture. A French engineer named Jean Laborde, one of the few Europeans Ranavalona tolerated because he could manufacture guns and taught her army to make gunpowder, documented what he witnessed. Men arrive at construction sites, carrying their own tools and their own food, for what they hope will be enough days. They work from dawn to sunset without rest, except to vomit from exhaustion. Those who collapse are dragged aside and given 1 hour to recover. If they don't recover, they're thrown into the foundation pits while still breathing. The Queen says their bodies strengthen the buildings spiritually and practically. The mathematics of death through labor were staggering. To transport one massive stone beam from the quarry to the palace required 4,000 men pulling ropes for 70 miles over mountain terrain. The journey took 4 months. Of those 4,000 men, approximately 1,000 died from exhaustion, disease, accidents, or execution for moving too slowly. The beam they died moving was one of 300 needed for just the palace expansion. The Queen's new throne room alone cost 8,000 lives. But moving stones was luxury compared to the Queen's industrial projects. Ranavalona wanted Madagascar to be completely self-sufficient, to need nothing from Europeans except their fear. She ordered the creation of munitions factories capable of producing 10,000 muskets per year, ironworks that could smelt cannons, textile mills to clothe her armies, all built and operated through forced labor. Men who had been farmers were suddenly smelting iron in furnaces that regularly exploded, each explosion treated as sabotage, requiring executions. Women who had woven baskets were operating mechanical looms that removed fingers with industrial efficiency, the severed digits swept up with sawdust at day's end. The Mantasoa Industrial Complex, 40 miles from the capital through terrain so rough that horses died attempting it, became Madagascar's first factory town and its largest graveyard. 10,000 workers were stationed there permanently, forbidden to leave, working in conditions that killed 20% annually through accidents alone. The iron foundry consumed 300 lives per year through burns, carbon monoxide poisoning, and heat exhaustion in temperatures that could cook eggs. The gunpowder factory exploded 7 times during Ranavalona's reign, each explosion killing between 50 and 200 workers. The bodies were left in the rubble as warnings against carelessness. Workers received no payment except permission to live another day. Food was whatever they could grow in small plots during the 2 hours of darkness between work ending and sleep becoming mandatory. Families were separated systematically, with men at labor sites, women in agricultural camps, and children in youth brigades. This separation was deliberate, preventing emotional support that might fuel resistance. A man might not see his wife for 3 years, returning to find children he'd never met and a wife who'd aged decades. Disease spread through labor camps with algorithmic efficiency. Cholera, dysentery, malaria, and unknown fevers killed more workers than accidents. Medical care was not just absent, but forbidden. Seeking treatment was considered avoiding work. The sick were quarantined in structures called patients' houses, where infected workers were left without food, water, or care to either recover through their own strength or die without infecting others. The bodies were burned every Sunday in mass pyres that could be smelled 10 miles away and seen from the capital on clear days. Women faced their own forced labor particular to their sex. While men built and manufactured, women were conscripted into agricultural projects that were no less deadly. Rice paddies needed to be expanded into marshlands where crocodiles were considered a natural workforce reducer. The Queen wanted cotton plantations, despite Madagascar's climate being completely unsuitable, requiring women to work in conditions that guaranteed failure and execution for sabotage. They worked waist-deep in water filled with leeches that had to be burned off each evening, leaving scars that marked them as laborers forever. Children weren't exempt from the death economy. By age 8, they were required to participate in light labor, carrying water to workers in buckets that weighed more than the children, gathering materials while dodging falling rocks, running messages between camps faster than adults could walk. By 12, they were considered full laborers capable of dying like adults. The Queen established youth brigades that were essentially child slave armies, building their own barracks from materials they quarried, growing their own inadequate food, and dying at rates that exceeded adult casualties. Some communities developed resistance strategies that required extraordinary courage. They would hide young men in caves when the drums sounded, claiming plague had killed them. They created fake illness epidemics using herbs that mimicked symptoms, though being caught meant execution. They sabotaged projects subtly, ensuring buildings would need constant repair rather than new construction, keeping men closer to home. The Queen responded with collective punishment mathematics. If a village didn't meet its labor quota, Every third person would face the Tangina ordeal. If sabotage was suspected, every second person. If proven, everyone. While the rest of Africa was being carved up like a wedding cake at European dinner parties in Berlin and London, Madagascar remained independent. Not because European powers didn't want it, they desperately did, but because Queen Ranavalona made colonization more expensive in blood and treasury than any European government could justify to voters who couldn't find Madagascar on a map. The French tried first with typical colonial arrogance. In 1829, just 1 year into Ranavalona's reign, they bombarded the eastern port of Tamatave, demanding trading rights, protection for Christians, and a permanent garrison. Ranavalona's response was to execute every Malagasy who had ever traded with the French, display their heads on stakes along the beach in order of height, and send a message written in French. "The ocean is my rice field's border. Cross it uninvited, and you will fertilize my soil. Your skulls will make excellent cups for my warriors." The British tried diplomacy wrapped in threats. They sent delegations offering modernization, education, and military training in exchange for influence. Ranavalona accepted the gifts, including modern cannons, listened to the proposals while serving tea in skull cups she claimed were from French soldiers, then had her guards escort the diplomats to the harbor with a counter-message. "Madagascar needs nothing from nations that cannot keep their own people from starving. Solve your Irish problem before offering to solve mine." But Ranavalona understood something crucial that European powers missed. Europeans could conquer territory with guns and treaties, but they couldn't conquer disease. Madagascar's coastal lowlands were fever swamps where malaria, dengue, yellow fever, and unnamed diseases thrived. She deliberately kept the highlands healthy while allowing the coasts to remain pestilential, creating a biological moat around her kingdom. Any invading army would have to pass through these killing fields where mosquitoes were more deadly than muskets. In 1845, a combined French-British naval squadron arrived at Tamatave with 60 ships and 8,000 men. An ultimatum backed by the largest colonial force ever assembled in the Indian Ocean. Ranavalona's response was brilliant in its calculated cruelty. She evacuated the coastal towns of all valuable people and property, leaving only the elderly, diseased, and volunteers who had been infected with various diseases in what amounted to biological warfare. When the Europeans landed, they found ghost towns populated by the dying. Within 2 weeks, fever had killed more sailors than any battle could have. Within a month, 40% were sick. The squadron retreated, leaving behind 2,000 dead who were immediately beheaded and their skulls added to the Queen's collection. The Queen then created what she called the sovereignty through suffering policy, a diplomatic strategy based on horror. If Europeans wanted to trade with Madagascar, they had to accept her terms completely. They could only land at specified ports during certain seasons. They could only trade with designated representatives who were usually criminals given one chance to prove loyalty. They could never travel inland, beyond sight of their ships. They could never own property, marry Malagasy, or learn the language. And most importantly, they had to witness executions. Every European trader who wanted to do business in Madagascar was required to attend at least one public execution, usually a mass Tangina ordeal or cliff throwing, specifically scheduled for their arrival. They had to stand in designated areas where the condemned's blood might splatter on their uniforms. They had to watch without showing emotion that might be interpreted as sympathy. The message was clear. You are here at my suffering, witnessing what I do to my own people. Imagine what I would do to invaders. A French trader named Lambert wrote in his journal, discovered in his estate after his death. The Queen has transformed horror into diplomacy. She makes us complicit in her atrocities, simply by conducting commerce. We stand watching Christians thrown from cliffs, then negotiate prices for rice and cattle with the same officials who ordered the executions. She has made us all collaborators in hell. The profit margins are excellent. Ranavalona's greatest strategic innovation was deliberate depopulation of invasion routes. She identified every possible path an invading army might take from the coast to the highlands, using French and British military manuals she'd had translated. Then, she systematically destroyed every village along those routes, forcibly relocated the populations to camps in the interior, burned all crops, including seed stores, poisoned wells with animal carcasses, and created 300-mile dead zones where no invading army could find food, water, or shelter. The French called it the desert strategy, though it was more like creating hell on earth. The human cost of this strategy defied comprehension. Approximately 300,000 people were forcibly relocated from coastal regions to the interior in marches that made the Trail of Tears look like a parade. They were given 1 hour to gather possessions. Families were deliberately separated to prevent organized resistance. The elderly and infirm were left behind to die. The death rate during these forced migrations exceeded 50% from starvation, disease, and execution of stragglers. When the French consul protested the execution of French-trained Malagasy engineers who had been building bridges, Ranavalona had him brought to watch another execution, this time of Malagasy, who had learned English from British missionaries. "You see," she told him through a translator while pointing at the dying, "I am impartial in my xenophobia. Your language and the British language die equally on my island. Would you like to test if French blood and British blood flow the same?" The British attempted gunboat diplomacy in 1852, sailing their newest warships into Tamatave Harbor in a show of force. Ranavalona's response was to execute 1 Christian for every cannon on the British ships, in full view of the sailors who could do nothing but watch through telescopes. 57 people died over 3 hours. The British admiral wrote in his log, "We could bombard the city to rubble in an hour. But what victory is there in rubble? We could land troops and take the coast in a day. But what glory in conquering graves? The Queen has made Madagascar worthless by making it hell." By 1855, European powers had essentially given up on conquering Madagascar while Ranavalona lived. They would trade at her ports, under her terms, witnessing her atrocities, because the alternative was attempting to conquer an island whose ruler would rather see it completely depopulated than colonized. Madagascar remained the only major African territory besides Ethiopia to resist colonization during this period, though the price was the transformation of the island into what one British diplomat called a sovereign graveyard. On August 16th, 1861, Queen Ranavalona I died peacefully in her sleep at age 83. She lay in a bed made from wood harvested by slaves who died carrying it, covered in silk woven by women who went blind from the detailed work, wearing jewelry taken from executed nobles whose names were forgotten, surrounded by loyal courtiers who had survived by informing on others. Her last breath was as gentle as a baby's sigh, as easy as the first breath of the millions who had died gasping under her reign. She had outlived 5 British monarchs, 4 French rulers, 11 American presidents, and countless European diplomats who had sworn to see her removed. She died undefeated in war, having never faced a rebellion serious enough to threaten her throne, never undergone the Tangina ordeal she prescribed for others, never experienced even a moment of the suffering she had inflicted on approximately half of Madagascar's population. The news of her death spread across Madagascar through the traditional drums, the same drums that had summoned forced laborers to their deaths for 33 years. But this time, the rhythm was different. The death pattern, reserved for royalty, echoed from hilltop to hilltop at sunset. In villages, people stopped everything, not from grief but from disbelief that bordered on paralysis. Many thought it was an elaborate trick, that the Queen was testing their loyalty, that celebrating would trigger mass executions. For 3 days, nobody worked, nobody celebrated, nobody even spoke above whispers. For 3 days, Madagascar held its collective breath. The island existed in suspended animation, waiting to see if the woman who had terrorized them for 3 decades was actually gone, or if this was her cruelest trick yet. Only when her body was displayed publicly in the palace courtyard, when people could see with their own eyes the sunken cheeks and clouded eyes that proved the Blood Queen no longer breathed, when brave souls touched the corpse and lived, did the transformation begin. Her son, Radama II, took power and immediately reversed everything with the frantic energy of someone trying to wake from a nightmare. Within his first week, he ended the Tangina ordeal, burning all remaining poison nuts in a bonfire that could be seen for miles. He freed all forced laborers, though many didn't know where home was anymore. He invited missionaries back, though few initially believed it was safe. He opened Madagascar to European trade without execution requirements. The massive construction projects were abandoned so quickly that tools were left mid-swing. The factories were closed, their furnaces going cold for the first time in decades. The instruments of torture were destroyed, melted down into farming tools, in a symbolism that nobody missed. But the scars couldn't be erased by royal decree. Madagascar's population had been nearly halved from 5 million to 2.5 million. Entire ethnic groups had been decimated to the point of extinction. Traditional knowledge had been lost when master craftsmen died in labor camps, taking secrets passed down for generations. Agricultural systems had collapsed when farmers became builders and never returned. The island, that had been approaching prosperity in 1828, was now among the poorest places on Earth, its wealth extracted through death. The psychological damage was generational. 3 generations had grown up, knowing that accusation meant death, that neighbors were probably informants, that survival required absolute submission to authority, no matter how insane. Trust between communities had been shattered and replaced with suspicion. Traditional social structures had been perverted into instruments of terror. The Malagasy had learned to fear their own traditions, their own authorities, their own neighbors, their own shadows. Children had watched parents die. Parents had denounced children. Siblings had informed on siblings. The family unit itself had become unreliable. Yet history has been surprisingly kind to Ranavalona, particularly in recent decades. Modern Malagasy nationalists celebrate her as the queen who kept Madagascar independent during the peak of European colonialism, conveniently forgetting that she achieved this by killing Malagasy. They point out that Ethiopia and Madagascar were the only major African territories to resist colonization during her lifetime, not mentioning that Madagascar's resistance came through suicide. They argue that the death toll, while horrific, preserved Malagasy sovereignty when the alternative was cultural extinction under European rule, though it's hard to preserve culture when you've killed everyone who carries it. This historical revision ignores inconvenient facts that destroy the nationalist narrative. Madagascar was colonized by France just 34 years after Ranavalona's death, partly because she had so weakened the country demographically and psychologically that it couldn't resist. The cultural traditions she claimed to protect were so corrupted by their use as weapons that many Malagasy welcomed European intervention as liberation from their own traumatized systems. The sovereignty she maintained through mass murder lasted exactly 1 generation. International historians still debate her death toll with the passion of accountants arguing over genocide statistics. Conservative estimates say 1 million died during her reign. Aggressive estimates say 3 million. The truth is probably around 2.5 million, but even the lowest number represents 20% of the population. By comparison, Stalin's purges killed about 3% of the Soviet population. Pol Pot killed 25% of Cambodia. Ranavalona potentially matches history's worst genocidal leaders, except her victims were her own people, killed not for ideology but for the principle of absolute control. The British missionary William Ellis, who returned to Madagascar after her death to find a nation of walking wounded, wrote, "The island feels haunted by the living as much as the dead. Every family has members who were executed, who died in labor camps, who fled and never returned, who survived but wish they hadn't. There is not a village without a mass grave, not a cliff without bones at its base, not a family without ghosts at their table. The queen is dead, but her victims remain, in the earth, in the memory, in the damaged souls of survivors who cannot forget what they've seen, what they've done to survive, what they've become. Her funeral was a masterpiece of contradiction that captured her entire reign. She was buried with full royal honors in the sacred tomb of sovereigns at Ambo-Hepatsi, ironically near the cliff where she had thrown thousands to their deaths. Her body was wrapped in silk, woven by slaves who had gone blind from the work, placed in a silver coffin built by forced labor from metal mined by children, carried by nobles whose families she had decimated but who performed their duties perfectly from muscle memory of fear. The funeral oration praised her for preserving Madagascar's independence while carefully avoiding mention of the cost, like praising a surgeon for removing a tumor by killing the patient. Queen Ranavalona died, believing she had saved Madagascar. In her mind, every execution was medicine, purging foreign infection from the national body. Every forced laborer was a patriot, building indigenous strength through suffering. Every Christian thrown from cliffs was a sacrifice to sovereignty, their screams prayers for independence. She had created paradise through pain, independence through death, purity through poison. The mathematics were simple. Better to rule a graveyard than serve in paradise. This is the pattern that repeats through history, with mechanical precision. Leaders who believe that suffering purifies, that death creates life, that destroying part of the population saves the whole. They always die peacefully, these architects of agony, because they surround themselves with the traumatized survivors who have learned that opposing power means joining the dead. They die in beds while their victims died on cliffs, in comfortable old age while their victims died in youth, with last words while their victims had their tongues cut out. Ranavalona never drank the Tangina poison she prescribed for hundreds of thousands. She never stood in the forced labor gangs she conscripted, never felt the heat of furnaces that consumed workers, never knew the weight of stones that crushed carriers. She never felt the cliff's edge beneath her feet, never experienced the second before the push, never knew the sensation of falling while bound to your family. She experienced her reign from palace windows and elevated platforms, watching smoke rise from mass cremations, hearing drums summon workers to their deaths, receiving reports of successful executions in the same tone as weather reports. The mathematics of her reign remain staggering no matter how you calculate them. If she killed 2.5 million people over 33 years, that's 75,000 per year, 200 per day, 8 per hour, 1 every 7.5 minutes of her entire reign, including the time she spent sleeping, eating, and planning more deaths. While she slept in silk sheets, someone was dying on her orders. While she ate meals prepared by terrorized cooks, someone was being forced to drink poison. While she held court, someone was falling from a cliff. The killing never stopped, it only varied in method. Yet she died at 83, an extraordinary age for that era when most people died by 50. She never faced justice, never experienced consequences, never even acknowledged that what she did might be wrong. The universe offered no karma, no divine retribution, no dramatic irony where she died by her own methods. She simply went to sleep one night and didn't wake up, as peaceful an end as any grandmother surrounded by grandchildren could wish, except her grandchildren were either dead or too traumatized to approach. Her last recorded words, spoken to her son the day before she died, were, "Keep Madagascar for the Malagasy." She didn't say, "Keep the Malagasy alive." She didn't say, "Protect the people." She said, "Keep Madagascar, the land, the idea, the sovereignty." The people were always secondary to the principle, expendable components in the machinery of independence. She died, believing she had succeeded. Today, Madagascar is one of the world's poorest countries, still recovering from Ranavalona's demographic catastrophe. The population she halved has recovered numerically but not psychologically. The traditions she weaponized remain suspect. The sovereignty she preserved through suffering was lost to colonization anyway, making all those deaths ultimately meaningless. Every goal she pursued resulted in its opposite, except one: she is remembered. The blood-drinking queen achieved immortality through atrocity, becoming history's reminder that sometimes the worst monsters die peacefully in their beds. Standing at Ambohipatsi Cliff today, you can still see scratches in the rock where fingernails clawed for grip as bodies fell. Local guides say that on quiet mornings, you can hear hymns rising from the gorge, the voices of Christians still singing as they fell. This is mythology, of course. The dead don't sing. But the living remember, and sometimes memory sounds like music, sometimes like screaming, sometimes like the splash of bodies hitting water after falling 150 feet onto rocks that were sharpened specifically to ensure death was instant but not painless. The Tangina tree still grows in Madagascar's forests. The nut is still toxic enough to kill within hours, but nobody uses it for trials anymore. It's just a tree now. It's poison neutral, waiting. Because that's what history teaches us. The tools of terror are always available. They grow in forests, sit in museums, rest in archives, waiting for someone to transform them from objects to instruments. What transforms them is human decision, the choice to make suffering into system, death into diplomacy, murder into method. Queen Ranavalona proved that sovereignty can be maintained through suffering, that independence can be purchased with blood, that a ruler can kill half their population and die peacefully in bed. She proved that there is no cosmic justice, no guaranteed retribution, no inevitable consequence for evil. Sometimes monsters die of old age, surrounded by comfort, their last breath as easy as their first. History doesn't promise justice, only documentation. But she also proved something else, perhaps more important. That horror, at this scale, cannot be hidden forever. That suffering, this systematic, leaves evidence in bones, in documents, in traumatized cultures. That even when the perpetrator escapes justice, the truth endures in mass graves, in survivor testimonies, in the genetic memory of terror passed down through generations. Every mass grave speaks its inventory of bones. Every survivor remembers what they survived. Every descendant carries the cellular memory of their ancestors' terror. The blood-drinking queen drank no literal blood, despite her nickname. But she spilled enough to turn rivers red during executions, to soak soil so thoroughly that farmers say certain fields still won't grow white flowers, only red ones. This is mythology too, probably. Soil doesn't remember blood any more than stones remember screams. But people do, and people tell stories, and stories become history, and history becomes warning. Or it should. The pattern of paradise through pain continues, just with different names, different methods, different justifications. The tools evolve, but the impulse remains. The belief that paradise can be achieved through purging, that perfect societies require imperfect people to die, that sovereignty justifies any suffering. The Queen Ranavalona of today don't use tangina, poison, or cliff throwing. They use more modern methods. But the formula remains: paradise through pain, painted in someone else's blood. The warning of Ranavalona is not just about the past, but about the eternal present possibility of such horror. It reminds us that, given the right circumstances, the right fear, the right justification, any society can transform into a machine for systematic suffering. The distance between civilization and sanctioned sadism is measured not in centuries but in decisions. We are always closer to the cliff's edge than we think.